Okay, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you here for our 26th Monk School International Institute on Social Policy. Some of you were here last night for what I thought was an incredibly stimulating keynote address by economist Carol Graham and a fun reception. It was really great to catch up with many of my colleagues and students and friends and to meet new people who are interested and engaged in social policy and tackling some, I think, the most challenging issues of our time. We have a really rich and exciting program today. Really excited to get started. Unfortunately, there is one change to the program I just want to let you know about. I heard from Josh Hartson, Arson, sorry, about last night, and unfortunately, he has to have an emergency appendectomy, and so, yeah, poor guy. He was so excited to speak, and I do hope we can arrange a future event to let him share some of the amazing work that he's doing on AI and job matching. But so he's unfortunately unable to join us, but I think everybody else is here or on their way, and so again, very excited to start us off. For those of you who weren't here last night, the kind of format for the day is we're going to have several sessions. The first two sessions, we're going to go back to back, and then we'll have a coffee break and then another session and then lunch and another session, coffee break, and then we'll wrap up. Each presenter is going to present for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we're going to have about a 30-minute Q&A in each session. We have about 100 people registered to join us virtually today as well. So while myself or someone else is going to be fielding some questions from the virtual audience as well, and they'll be called on occasionally to contribute questions to the Q&A. If you have a question, that's fantastic. I'm going to have you raise your hands, and then one of the staff will bring you a microphone so the people who are watching online can hear your question clearly, and ask that you tell us your name and some of who you are, your affiliation, before your question, and ask that you try to keep it to one question just because there's a lot of people and we want to keep the discussion going. So that's pretty much all of the kind of background detail I think that we need. Again, I'm really excited you're here. I hope you get a chance to learn something today, that you get a chance to feel like you got to engage on some really important social policy research and issues, learn about some innovations, and also most importantly, to meet some new people and to network. We have about 10 student research poster presentations outside. So during the break or lunch, I hope you get a chance to take a look. The students are here, and if they're by their poster, you can ask them questions about their work and where they're going with it. So other than that, I don't think I have any other kind of housekeeping. And again, special thanks to the Employment and Social Development Canada and the Monk School for their support of this event. So I have the great pleasure of introducing the moderator for our first session of the conference this morning, which is called Unsettled Times: What Role for Social Policy? Tracking Well-Being Across Nations and Time. I feel very fortunate that we have Paul Thompson, the Deputy Minister of Employment and Social Development Canada, moderating this session. He has served in many senior roles in the federal government, including Deputy Minister of Public Services and Procurement and Associate Deputy Minister at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. He holds a master's degree in economics from Queen's University and is a University of Toronto alumni, where he completed his Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Political Science. Thank you, Deputy Minister Thompson, for moderating this session.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Dan, for that introduction. I would like to start off, as you did, Dan, last night, with a land acknowledgement that we have the privilege and honor to be on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations this morning, including the Anishinaabe peoples, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, as well as the Wendat peoples. So it's, as always, a great honor and privilege to be able to enjoy and make great use of the lands that we are on today. And it's indeed a great pleasure to be moderating this conference today. I'd like to extend my thanks to Dan and his team at the Monk School for organizing an excellent program. I must say that this conference, like its predecessors at Queen's, it's a very important event in the life of my department, Employment and Social Development, and I think for other policy practitioners as well. It's a great opportunity to make connections and refresh our understanding on really important trends and socioeconomic issues. And I don't think I'm suffering from a present time bias to say that I think takes on a heightened importance right now in these, as we say, these unsettled times. Just how profound the challenges are that we are facing. And I think these disruptions and trends that we're looking at and talking about are having and have potential to have very significant impacts on the well-being of Canadians. So really eager to dive into that and explore that. I think it's safe to say that we've had a pretty bumpy ride of late with lots of noise and disruptions. Over the last decade, I think there was a slow and steady progress being made on some important indicators like poverty rates. Then we had the massive disruption of the pandemic, which turned almost everything upside down for a period of time, followed by a rather unprecedented surge of social supports that came in to support the pandemic, and I think did a bit biased, but pretty impressive job, I think, of maintaining people's well-being over the course of the pandemic. And then we had, on the heels of that, this surge of inflation leading to an affordability crisis. And now, thankfully, and recently we've seen the inflation rate come back down. So there's a lot going on out there. That's kind of the noise on the surface in a shorter time period, and underlying that are some deeper secular trends, I think, that are really important to understand. Canada, of course, has long-standing and progressive investments in an important income support system, and those have continued to be made. We'll hear a little bit this morning, I think, about the impact that those measures have had and are having. But it goes beyond the indicators. I think it's quite clear that we see a bit of a disconnect between the economic indicators that we see and how people are feeling on the ground. That manifests itself in many different ways, and it raises really important questions. Are we actually measuring the right things when we look at socioeconomic indicators? Are we missing things that are important to people? I thought last night's discussion and Dr. Graham's observations were fascinating, and it gets us into that space of what beyond the traditional economic and socioeconomic indicators we ought to be looking at that are either consequences or even causes of some of the challenges that we face. Second observation, as said, I'm in the Department of Employment and Social Development, so I'm actually fascinated with the link between employment and social development and how much of this links to the evolution in the labor market, what's happening to wages, employment levels, and the challenges being faced there. I think those are both economic, and it gives rise to some social phenomena, social tensions as well. So unpacking that is also really important. So all of this, it leads to really important policy discussions, social policy, economic policy, but also the harder to grasp issue of the social fabric of Canada and people's sense of confidence and hope. I hope we can dig into all of that with this morning's panel. We have a very distinguished panel with us today. We have first up on my right, Stefano Scarpetta, who is the Director of Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs at the OECD. He's had that role since 2013. Stefano is a leading expert in these areas, and I know this from personal experience. Stefano is often called upon to set the stage when G7, G20, OECD ministers get together, and he does a fabulous job of doing that. I've seen that up close. I'd also say that Stefano is a great friend of Canada. We've had lots of great collaborations over the years, and demonstrated most recently by the travel trajectory that he took to get here from Bogota, Washington, and I don't know how many other places to get here to Toronto today. So Stefano's going to obviously set a bit of an international context and look at different types of social protections and practices that are in place in other OECD countries. So that'll be an important scene setter for the discussion. Our second panelist is Kelly Foley, who's associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Saskatchewan, specializing in labor economics, the economics of education, and applied econometrics. Kelly has published extensively in scientific journals and has noteworthy recognitions for her writing. Kelly will obviously look at more of the domestic angle on these questions, looking at evidence of how Canada is doing and provide what I'm sure will be some interesting observations on what is going well and what might not be going well. Finally, our third panelist, Andrew Parkin, is Executive Director at Environics, where he focuses on fostering dialogue amongst diverse stakeholders, using evidence to guide decision-making in public policy. He has a background in political sociology and extensive leadership experience across multiple organizations, and he too is widely published and is an often commentator in both English and French media. Andrew will provide insights and give us a sense of the mood of Canadians, and I think he might be picking up also on some of the thoughts that Dr. Graham had last night on some of the links between economic indicators, social indicators, and the moods and sentiments of Canadians. So I think we're in for a very exciting morning. I am going to leave it there and turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Stefano Scarpetta. Please welcome Stefano.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister, dear Paul. Good morning to all of you, and a big thanks to the Munk University and the Munk Institute, International Institute on Social Policy. I don't know, I can sort of consider myself a regular. This is the second time. The first time was virtual, but I'm really pleased to be with all of you on a topic that I think, as Paul and actually yesterday Dr. Graham said, I think is central for all of us, for all of those who are interested in policy making. Let me see. Do I have to do something? Beautiful. Thanks a lot. The first observation I'd like to share with you is that at OECD and certainly in Canada and a number of other countries, we have been talking about the human-centric, people-centered policy for a long time. I think maybe if we're talking about social policy, they have to be human-centric. The problem is that we have developed a number of frameworks, but we do not really have a lot of indicators, data, to assess how much focus our policy are to what matters for people. So one of the efforts that we have tried to make at OECD, you will see more about the multidimensional well-being indicators, is trying not only to develop, again, frameworks to assess how policy are or not human-centered, but actually try to develop specific indicators to assess that. And I'd like to give you two examples of that. It was back in 2018, and actually Canada hosted the Social Policy Ministerial with Minister Duclos. And with the Minister Duclos, we were discussing, okay, we are going to have a very good discussion about social policy in the OECD country. How much do we know about what matters for people? What kind of risk they are facing? And whether or not our policy are geared to actually help them address these risks. So we developed the first ever at the OECD opinion poll on what matters for people, the risks that people face in the short, in the medium, and the longer term. And we launched the preliminary result at the Social Policy Ministerial under the chairmanship of Duclos, Minister Duclos, in Montreal. And it was, I would say, a game changer. I have to tell you, and I think Dr. Graham said that yesterday, that at the beginning at the OECD, this idea was received with quite a significant degree of skepticism. I mean, this is the OECD looking at opinion poll. How come? In fact, I think now, and we have a social policy ministerial in February of 2025, and we will present the result of the fourth wave of the risks that matter. And indeed, this will shape also discussion among the ministers, and has been shaping the way we at the OECD have been looking at the role of social policy. Let me give you another example. For a long time, when we look at health policies, we have said these have to be patient-centered. Of course, at OECD, we have a framework to see how much health policies are actually patient-centered. Do we know whether patients actually believe that the health system is serving them well? No. We have plenty of indicators at the OECD about how much countries spend, what resources they have in terms of doctors, nurses, hospitals, beds in the hospitals, what are the outcomes in terms of life expectancy and clinical outcomes, but we don't really know how people feel about the health and how people feel about the outcome they get from the health system. So we developed the first ever patient-reported indicator survey, and the result will be published in February of next year, in which for the first time we asked people, 100,000 patients in 20 countries of the OECD and 1,500 practitioners, about what are the experience and the outcome from health point of view of patient, of individual 45 plus. And there are a number of very interesting results emerging from that. I'm saying this long introduction just to say that there is a lot we can do to measure what matters for people. And I think now the technology will definitely allow us to do more on that. So let me move on to the first point, which is the measurement of well-being. And of course, yesterday, Carol Graham said, you know, GDP is a well-established indicator. It's easy, accessible. We have it. We have projection on that. So it's easy to use it, but we definitely have to go beyond that. And at OECD, we are indeed developing this holistic approach, looking at well-being, that, as you see in a second, will include a number of important dimensions, 11 important dimensions. And I think already, little by little, this indicator have started populating the policy debate, not only among the Minister of Employment and Social Affairs, or actually health, but actually among the Minister of Finance, which is certainly a major achievement if we want to see changes. So what are these 11 dimensions? These you've seen here, they consider sort of material condition, the shape, of course, the economic option, the quality of life, along the 11 dimensions. So we look at income and wealth, environmental quality, work-life balance, and more. You see that there are 3 blocks, if you like. We look at the dimension from income, resources, housing, health. We look at the averages, but actually we look at the distribution, which is fundamental if you want to understand what really matters for people. And this inclusion focus is actually one of the key important points. We have to move beyond the average if we want to understand actually how different groups in our population are feeling along this 11 dimension. And you see that we have added also on the bottom of this also a sustainability or a resource focus, in which we look at the long-term drivers of well-being from a resource point of view, but also from resource being natural capital, economic capital, human capital, and social capital. And there again, we look at the stocks, we look at the flows, we look at risk factor and resilience. So this is the framework. And again, I'm happy to say that we are about to launch the new sort of report on how's life. In fact, this is the publication that will be launched in a week when the OECD in Rome will host the 7th OECD World Forum on Well-being. And this How Life include about 80 indicators now on well-being, with a lot of data visualization that allow people actually to, on the web page, to look at how their country compare across the dimensions that matter the more for them. We're also trying to look at the new frontiers on terms of measurement, looking at subjective well-being, trust, mental health, and social connectedness. And for instance, we have developed even guidance for countries on how to measure child subjective well-being. Of course, there is much more work that remains to be done to actually populate this framework and to have better indicator. So in the 24th edition, again, that will be launched in about 2 weeks from now, we look at, we identify dimensions of well-being and sustainability that have been most impacted by the recent crisis. Paul was referring to the COVID-19 crisis, which was a massive shock to all our population, to all of us, but also the most recent cost of living crisis. And also we analyze the gap in well-being across population groups, something which definitely we have to make even more progress. So let me go into the example of Canada. And this is, you can see that in this well-being wheel, if you call it like that. So each of the bar here from low to high represent how Canada in this particular case does on these 11 dimensions compared to the OECD. So the longest the bar, the better Canada is compared to the OECD country. Again, it's not absolute, it's relative to the performances on the same indicator for the other countries of the OECD. And I think, yesterday we talked a lot about hope. Let's look at the positive. You see that Canada, most of the bars are actually pretty high. In many of the dimensions, Canada actually outperformed the OECD averages, Whether it is about income, of course, is a wealthy country, when it comes in terms of wealth, social connection, environmental quality, knowledge, skills, health, work, and actually job quality. So altogether, if I were to compare and to give a sense, this is a pretty positive outcome compared to what you see in most of the OECD countries. Yet, of course, you see that there are some of the bars which are not particularly high, pretty low, and these have to do with housing affordability, an issue in Canada, I know, very serious, but also a number of other countries. Time off work, so how can people really share between the time at work and time off work, but also feeling safe. This is just an example to tell you that this very simple framework with these indicators can also shape the way in which you look at what are the specific issues that Canada in this case is facing, and maybe try to understand better how can we make progress along these different dimensions of well-being. In fact, let me go quickly through some of these dimensions. Starting from the housing cost. Here you see the horizontal line. This is the situation in 2015, and then you see the evolution. 2005 is the dot, and the bar is actually the latest information for 2022. In many countries, but also in particular, I shall say in Canada, there has been a significant increase in housing cost. And this is not unique to Canada by no means. You see that the bars for most of the countries are higher than the dot and higher than the horizontal line, which is again 2015. And this is an issue. In 2018, we actually published a report that was called Under Pressure, the Squeezed Middle Class. And one of the evidence, and not only for Canada, but for the OECD countries, is that in the past 20 years, the housing costs have increased 3 times, sometimes 5 times more than income. And this is affect not the low-income household only, but actually the middle class as well. In fact, that report on the squeezed middle class look at what is the probability, the share of the population of different generations to belong to the middle class. And one almost paradoxical result of that study was that from the baby boom generation to the most recent generations, the probability of the following generation after the baby boom to be part of the middle class declines systematically in most of the OECD countries. So these are the most educated generation get into the labor market, and yet for them to be part of the middle class actually is getting more and more difficult. It's not only that, but certainly the cost of housing, which is one of the elements that possibly characterize being part of the middle class, is one of the factors that actually prevent or make it more difficult for the young generation to be part of the middle class. The second I would like to focus on is also on hours work. You can see here Canada is on the right-hand side. It's still a country which 1,865 hours work per year, more than the OECD average. This is just an opening point to assess how we want to look into hours worked. It's not just a question of the total number of hours worked, but also flexibility in working time arrangement. And I think here the technology can be a major factor to allow us to work better, more effectively. Telework is one of the features of the COVID crisis, in which we discover that actually technology does allow for many people to work from home in an effective way. But I think we need to put in place the right institution, the right policy, the right infrastructure to allow everybody to actually exploit and use more the flexible work arrangement that actually are possible through the technology. And again, COVID clearly demonstrate that while it was possible for some workers to work from home effectively, that was not the case for many others, either because of the nature of their job or because they lack basic infrastructure, even a computer, laptop, to be able to do that. So we need to work not only on the total hours work, but actually what matters for people in terms of the way in which they manage their work. And this brings me to the second part of my talk, in which I'd like to look at the future of social protection. Actually, this is the very topic of the social policy ministry I was mentioning before. One of the important points here is actually, for the first time, I managed to get my committee, the Committee for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs, to launch a network of senior budget and senior social policy officials. I think it is fair to say that when Minister of Social Affairs talk, they identify a number of challenges they're facing, they identify programs that to put in place. When it comes into, do we have the money to implement these? There is silence, or there is embarrassment sometimes because maybe money is not there because the budget is tight in most of the countries. So What I think we are doing there is also to make sure that you got the Minister of Finance and Minister of Social Affairs talking to each other and to try and understand what are the major challenges, what are the major options that can be put in place, what could be considered social investment, and therefore something that by spending now, we save money down the road. Now, I think Paul said it very clearly, so I will go very quickly to that. Minister of Social Affairs are dealing, like all of us, I think, with multiple shocks and multiple transformation. Here you see the list of them, from population aging to the major sort of challenges that demographic changes is imposing in many countries. Digital transformation with artificial intelligence, we have been focusing on that a lot at OECD, and of course the green transition. All of that is imposing major transformation to all citizens, all population groups, at a very speed pace, and actually with profound changes. And I think there is a challenge for social policy to respond to all this transformation in a way to continue to provide effective support to all of those, and to actually help maximize access to opportunities while actually addressing some of the challenges. I will go quickly, but again, just to point how different countries are, but how much there is to be learned across country. The first one is this. And this is the, to some extent, forgotten mega trend, and this is the demographic changes. You see the evolution of the number of people of retirement age, 65 plus, per 1,000 people. And you see how this will evolve in the next less than 40 years. Now, having the share of the working age population declining by some 35% in some countries, or having the share of the people 65 plus increasing by as much as you can see in this chart, is something that we have never experienced in many sort of centuries, I would say. And this will make huge transformation in our economies, what kind of goods and services are in demand, but also despite whatever productivity projection you might have, how we are going to deal with a working age population which will shrink significantly. Look at Korea. It was a young country, will quickly become an old country, and this will impose tremendous transformation. I think it's fair to say that at OECD and beyond, when we look at how to make sure that people in good health can continue to stay in the labor market, we have focused a lot on the incentive side, so on pension systems. We have not focused enough, I would say, on the employability of older workers, and this is very much the focus of the work at OECD. What will make older people be willing and able to stay in the labor market? And I think much of the work we have done recently is on how much investing on training and retraining, job mobility, adapting working conditions can make a difference. But actually, frankly, that in those companies in which there is a more balanced age structure of the work population, actually productivity is higher. And this is something that actually resonates very well with employers who might think that actually replacing older workers with younger is not only cost saving in terms of wages, but actually brings more dynamic knowledge into the companies, which may or may not be true. Now, this is about Canada because, of course, I think, although despite all the effort made in Canada to promote access to employment to different groups, there are still gaps, as you can see here, across different dimensions of gender, the indigenous identity, disability status, where you can see big gaps in terms of employment. But also, let me say some of the positive things. Compared to many of the OECD countries, if you look at the right-hand side, the immigrant status and the labor force participation of immigrants is actually higher than the Canadian average. So, of course, in terms of integrating migrants and also refugees into the labor market has been, I think, one of the success stories of your country, not least because I would argue that you have a proactive migration policy for a long time in which actually migration flows are managed and to some extent also involves the employers, those who actually have to provide job opportunity to the migrants themselves. The other point, of course, in which all of the OECD countries have to look at is access to social protection. And this is the percentage of respondents in our Risk That Matters survey I was referring to you before that agrees that the government provides adequate income support in case of the employment loss. These are the 2022 result. And you see among the employees and the self-employed, Canada is one of the countries in which the gap is not that large, but you can see that in a number of other countries, I think the respondent varies between the employees and the self-employed. Again, we have to understand whether people feel that actually they can get access to the benefit in case of a shock like a loss of job, which, as Carol Graham told us, is one of the major shocks that actually affect individuals. The important point here is that in this survey, we also ask whether people were willing to pay more. So we say, okay, you're not fully satisfied with basically social program to help you in case of risk. Are you willing to pay more? And surprisingly enough, a significant part of the respondents said that they were willing to pay more if they can clearly see the benefit of the additional money they have to put into the system. So communicating on how contribution, social security contribution, help shaping better programs, I think is very important. Quickly on two more points. One is the change in family structure, which is significant in many of the OECD countries, to some extent less in Canada. But I think this is really changing the way in which we deliver social programs and social protection system, because we see that there is a higher percentage of the population living in single-person household. This has been a tremendous change we have seen over the past few decades, but this also changed the nature of access to different type of programs and the way in which we have to focus on some of these programs. So again, just a pointer to say how much data are important in order to assess the situation in an individual country, but also how this compare with other countries and maybe try to identify good practice that may exist in other countries. And the final point, again, in this quick overview of some of the big challenges and indicators, is on the climate change. This is again from our Risk That Matters survey, in which we ask people to see the degree of concern about climate change. And you can see that the blue bar is actually people that very or somewhat concerned. And in Canada, perhaps not surprising, also taking into account some of the latest events with wildfire and so on, people are very concerned. Now, I will conclude with that. The Employment Outlook, which is our flagship publication on employment issues of this year, is fully devoted to the green transition and the impact on the labor market. One of the interesting points is that, as you all know, we are not expecting a massive employment effect through the green transition at the aggregate level, but there will be significant distributional impact. 80% of emissions are in sectors that account for about 7% of employment. So the job loss will be highly concentrated in some geographical areas and among certain workers, while the benefit, use a broad definition of green job, we call green-driven jobs, account already for 20% of total employment. So the cost will be concentrated, the benefit will be widespread. They will not be in the same location where the job will be lost and the job will be created. And I think the transition to the new job will be particularly painful for the low-skilled workers in the high-emission sector. So we need to focus targeted policies, but I think we have to bring the impact on individual workers and community at the core of the green transitions, and not like left over a second thought once we have designed the green transitions. I conclude with that, but we have run a simple simulation about, suppose that we recycle all the revenue for carbon taxes just equally to everybody in the population. We can basically at least protect the low-income household from the additional cost that carbon taxes imposes on them. Now, it's easy to say because the revenue for carbon tax has already been used several times, but it's a pointer to say that some of these resources have to go to those who will be directly affected by the green transition. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and thank you to all the organizers for including me on this panel, which is really fascinating. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the day of conversations. So now I'm an economist, but before I became an economist, my first degree was in public admin. So it feels like a bit of a homecoming. Okay, so I want to spend my time today talking about inequality. And I'm going to begin by posing the question, why should we even talk about inequality on a panel about well-being? And of course, these two concepts are very different. You can have a society that is very equal, but none of the members of that society experience an appropriate level of well-being. However, I would argue that it's still worthwhile talking about inequality in these kinds of conversations because they help us learn something about fairness. So by studying inequality, we learn a bit about how the resources and the opportunities are allocated across society. So if we have some sense that those allocations are unfair, that might lead us to conclude that the allocation of outcomes or the distribution of outcomes are unfair. But on the other hand, if we think that the inequalities, at least to some degree, are reasonably or appropriately rewarding skill and talent and investment, we might regard that distribution as fair. So fairness is, of course, subjective, and it's subjective on a personal level, but also on a social level, right? So most policies that are trying to achieve social goals involve redistribution. And if there's too much inequality, or indeed too little inequality, it might not be sustainable. The implicit social contract that enables the structures that deliver the programs that are meant to ensure that people have widespread access to well-being, those kinds of systems and programs may not be sustainable with too much or too little inequality. So that's one of the reasons why I think we need to talk about inequality in the context of well-being. So with that in mind, let me give you a sort of a quick overview of what I want to talk about today. I'm going to start with a high-level description of inequality in Canada over the past 40 years. And so those are decades where we've experienced multiple unsettling times. And then next, I'm going to talk about how effective are our tax and transfer programs at mitigating inequality. And so this is a very aggregate way of thinking about social policy. So in some senses, as a whole, the tax and transfer systems that we have in Canada is a kind of summary measure of social policy. One of the key takeaways from that part of the discussion is going to be that inequality has actually been very stable in Canada since 2000. And that's not the same experience that the US has had, or indeed many countries in Europe. And so what makes Canada unique? And one of the reasons that Canada has had different inequality sort of trajectories from the US has to do with wages. So I'm going to make a pivot at that point and switch from talking about income to wages. And I'm going to raise the conjecture that minimum wages might play a role in how income inequality evolves in Canada. And I think of minimum wages as a social policy. So minimum wages redistribute from employers, workers, and consumers. And then I'm going to sort of conclude by discussing mentioning or raising the issue of what inequality cannot tell us about well-being. So the data that is in the graphs that I'm showing you today comes from joint work that I've done with David Green and Craig Riddell from UBC. And we were members of a part of a project that was led by the Institute for Fiscal Studies in the United Kingdom. And this was a 17-country study that gathered experts with the goal of building a coherent framework for discussing inequalities in income and labor market inequalities. So because that project had a labor market focus, the base population was people aged 25 to 59. So that's going to be the population base that is going to be underlying the pictures throughout my presentation. So that's important to keep in mind because, inequality among adults is different than inequality among children and seniors. And of course, I speak for myself and I don't represent the opinions of any of the individuals or any of the organizations that were a member of this project. Okay, so let's start with kind of a core indicator of inequality in the market. So what is the allocation of income that happens from market outcomes? So this is adjusted market income, which is total income before taxes, but without any government transfers. And what I'm plotting for you here is the Gini coefficient. So a Gini coefficient measures how far away from perfect inequality or perfect equality a distribution is. So 0 would be perfect equality, and numbers that are closer to 1 mean more inequality. So the first thing that you notice from this picture is that essentially the level of inequality that we experience now is inherited from the 90s. So during that very deep recession, inequality measured by the Gini rose by 4 percentage points, which is, a little bit more than a 10% rise in inequality. So this is really quite a substantial, quick rise. But then inequality is fairly flat throughout the 2000s, the 2010s. We do see a kind of a sharp uptick in 2020, undoubtedly related to the pandemic. So this is the market allocation. So the next thing that I'm showing you is the after-tax and after-transfer Gini coefficient in the red line. So the distance between the red and the blue line we can think about as being the extent to which we achieve redistribution. So you'll notice that the inequality throughout the 90s is rising much more slowly, and it is not rising as fast, or sorry, it's not rising to as high a level. And this particular picture is where it's important to keep in mind that this is adults, working age adults. Redistribution is much stronger among children and seniors. So that red line is actually much, much flatter if you include a broader population. Another thing that you'll notice is that, and this is going to come up quite a few times throughout the day, I'm sure, is that we did a very good job at mitigating that spike in inequality during COVID. So in fact, inequality in incomes after tax and transfers is lower in 2020, right? It's almost at its lowest point. So it's sort of, I think, important to remember when things work well, because if we don't recognize that, it's really hard to support these kinds of programs when they come under threat. And the final thing that I want to draw your eye to in this picture is that inequality before 2020, after 2015, is very slightly declining. Okay, so I want to kind of zoom in on that for a second. And I want to take us out one more data point. And by taking us out one more data point, I need to bring in some different series here. So what I have showing in the blue line is the CanSim. I'm so vintage. The Statistics Canada series, and Statistics Canada is computing inequality across the population. Okay, so this is why it's and this is disposable income inequality. It's lower than the red line, which is what we had from the previous picture. Another key difference between the statistics that we're computing and the Statistics Canada series is that we're using tax data. So the population of tax filers is different than the population of people who respond to the survey, which is the Canadian Income Survey. So the dotted red line is our sample definition of adults with the Canadian Income Survey. So you can sort of trace out where these differences are coming from, whether we're using tax filers versus survey data, population versus adults. And what you'll notice is that the levels are different, but the trends are more or less the same. And so because we can make these comparisons across, we can reasonably think that what's happening to the blue line will happen to the red lines. And so 2022, this kind of slight upward trend is continuing. I'm not prepared to say that this is a sharp change in trend. I think it's too soon to say. You could look at this picture and say, okay, well, we had this sharp decrease because of COVID, and we're just kind of returning to the trend as normal. Or it could be a complete reversal in trend, right? I think it's too soon to tell, but certainly we are at a point where it's not clear what 2023 and 2024 will show us. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so zooming back out again, here I'm showing you again the red line from the previous picture for Canada, disposable income inequality measured by a Gini. And I'm contrasting that with the US. So this is the same definitions used in the United States. And you can see that the Canadian experience is unique. Inequality has been rising consistently throughout this period for the United States. So what is it potentially that is different about the Canadian experience when we contrast it with the US? Okay, and so to dig a little bit deeper into that question, I want to pivot from income inequality to wage inequality. So of course, wages are a part of income, but even if you're just thinking about earnings, you have to keep in mind that earnings includes the number of weeks you work and the number of hours you work. So this is a different, wages are different from income, and it's important to keep that in mind. But one thing that's quite, one of the reasons that I want to kind of pivot to talk about wages is that what we know from prior research about the periods sort of before 2015 is that minimum wages played quite a big role in reducing inequality in Canada. So average minimum wages start rising around 2003, and research by Thomas Lemieux and Nicole Fortin have suggested that that had meaningful impacts on wage inequality. And the other thing that is unique, and coming from Saskatchewan, I understand how important this is the role of resource booms and the way that they lift up the wages, particularly for men who have less than college. So this also sort of, during this period, tucked up the bottom and the middle of the wage distributions and reduced wage inequality. So what's happening since 2015? So here I'm showing you the Gini coefficients for hourly wages. This is coming from the Labor Force Survey, and our wage series starts in 1997. So mind the scale here. So there is a small increase over the 20 years of around 2 points in the wage inequality, especially for men. But the scale is different than the previous scale. But around 2015, this pivots downward and starts trending downward. So why might that be? Of course, there's a lot of things going on in this period, but one of the things that's happening is that the large provinces are making substantial increases to their minimum wages. And when we look at wage growth over this period, we can see that growth is much larger at the bottom of the distribution of wages than it is at the top. So I don't know if these pictures are worse than equations. So let me walk you through what these pictures are. So take your eye to the top left-hand corner, because that's the picture for Canadian women. What you have going on along the bottom of the axis is that we've sort of lined everybody up by their 2015 wage. And then what's plotted in the line is how much wages grew between 2015 and 2019, real wages as a percentage. So when you can see that it's above that red line, it's wage growth, and below, wages are declining. And below the sort of the bottom 40% of wage earners for women in this picture is growing around sort of 10 to 5%, whereas there's kind of almost no growth above the median. So when wages are growing faster at the bottom than they are at the top, that means that inequality is falling. And you can see I've got the 3 large provinces that had large minimum wage increases in this period: British Columbia, Ontario, and Alberta. And then I have Saskatchewan and Quebec as comparators. Saskatchewan is an interesting, contrast to Alberta, because they have similar economies. I mean, Alberta is much larger, but it's not causal evidence, obviously, but one of these provinces had a minimum wage increase and the other one didn't. So this is what's happening for women. And just for completeness, this is what's happening for men. It's sort of a very similar pattern. But of course, the growth is a little bit more muted because fewer men tend to work in minimum wage jobs. So I don't want to try to claim, or, I'm not prepared to defend a causal relationship between the inequality pictures that I showed you and minimum wages. But what I do want to do is suggest that minimum wages are a social policy, and they should be a part of our social policy toolbook. And that kind of brings me back to talking about, what these images can't tell us about. So one thing about minimum wages is that they are reallocating any kind of economic rents or excess profits that are in labor markets, right? They're redistributing across workers, firms, consumers in ways that we don't fully understand. So one aspect of minimum wages that is really understudied is how that gets passed on to consumers through price increases. So in environments where we have inflation or inflationary pressures, there's almost surely limits to what we can achieve through minimum wage instruments. And the other thing that all of these pictures that I've showed you are about relative incomes. And price levels, we just divide by price, right? It's in the bottom, it's in the numerator and the denominator. But of course, the way that price increases are felt or experienced in terms of the material well-being that people can afford is unevenly experienced. Okay, and that doesn't come through in these pictures. And of course, material well-being is not the only important dimension of well-being, which we're going to hear many times. So that's why it's really rewarding and valuable to have these kinds of conversations that look at social policy from many different angles, like we're going to have throughout the day. Okay, so I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to get right into it. So I am with the Environics Institute, which is a very small but somewhat mighty not-for-profit public interest survey research organization. I want to say two things before I get started. One is we can do the range of surveys that I'm going to go through in the presentation because we're lucky enough to work with a number of partners on each of those projects. So I'll be showing data that being supported by YMCA Canada and the Toronto Foundation and Diversity Institute and Century Initiative, among others. But one of the main surveys I'm going to use is the Survey on Employment and Skills, which is a project that we do with the Future Skills Centre. And the Future Skills Centre is a project of the Government of Canada through ESDC. So I wanted to also thank Paul for also being part of the community that supports all the data that I'm going to show. The other thing I need to say by way of introduction is I have way too many slides. That's my thing. So it's partly because of my inability to make decisions, but it's partly because part of the point of the presentation is it's not one thing, but it's a lot of things. So I'm going to try and see how far we can get. I may have to abandon the end, but basically strap yourselves in because my solution to this is just to go really fast. Okay, so my job here is to kind of talk about where Canadians in general are about a number of these things. I'll echo some of what Stefano said around well-being, some of the things that Carol talked about last night. I'm going to just start with the least surprising slide that you're going to see at this conference, which is the overall sense of public satisfaction or dissatisfaction with how things are going. So we used to be about 60 satisfied, 40 dissatisfied. We came together, and then now we're 60 dissatisfied, 40 satisfied. Apart from just reminding us of where the majority of the population is right now, I think it's important to start about this with this slide because it tells an important story about the pandemic and what ultimately was a surprise. Because I think if you had asked me, and if you had asked a lot of people about in March, April 2020, about what's going to happen in general with how Canadians feel the country is doing, the answer would be it's going to get really bad, but then once we get through this, it's going to get better, right? And more or less the opposite happened. Now, I'm not talking about health, and I'm not talking about how emergency rooms cope with crisis. I'm talking about how people feel we're doing as a society. So the unsettled times, there was a time where we thought that's all about this, once in a lifetime disruption to the entire world, right? But it turns out that Canadians in general found the unsettled times is what came after. You can see that again if you look at a more directly economic indicator. So we have this question about whether it's a good time or a bad time to find a job where you live. Just look at the middle bars here. So this is the proportion saying a bad time. So this is just the start of the pandemic, and then the heart of the pandemic, obviously it got worse. And then the pandemic subsides a little bit and it starts getting better, and this is good. And if I'd stopped doing surveys at this point, we'd all feel really great. But then we kept going, right? And so what's interesting is this was what happens again coming out of the pandemic, where this sense of, in this case, how the economy is doing, how the job market is doing, starts getting worse again, right? So that was one specific question that asked people about how they felt about the job market, but it's really picking up on more general things. So here's a slide that shows what Canadians say the most important problem is facing the country right now. The important thing about this question is you can only give one answer, right? So it's zero sum. So you can see the pandemic, just jumps out of nowhere as being the top issue. When that happens, everything else has to go down. But when the pandemic subsides, the question is what takes over. And what takes over, and this won't surprise people, is inflation, cost of living, and affordable housing, a little bit healthcare and the economy and so on. I want to emphasize how new the inflation and affordable housing is. It is not new for Canadians to be worried about the economy. We have data on this going back to 1983. You can just see the economic cycle. But almost always when things get bad, it's unemployment, right? The affordable housing there, you can see it's zero in 2019. It's actually zero all the way back to 1983. Like, affordable housing has never registered as the top issue facing the country, right? It's only 12% now, but again, keep in mind this because there's only one answer. So a lot of other people are just saying inflation, cost of living. Okay, so that's what takes over and is driving the mood right now. Why does that matter? How does that spill into other issues? So some of you may have seen this survey in the news this week. The organization I work with actually has data going back to the 1970s about whether people feel there's too much immigration in Canada or not. I started this job in 2019, so I had 4 years of giving this presentation, going around spreading the good news that as immigration levels rose in Canada, Canadians increasingly got comfortable with that, and we're very unlikely to be concerned about immigration. And I wish I had retired at that point, but I didn't. And then this is what happens when you have sort of a housing crisis, a negative public mood, and feeling that pressure. So a dramatic reversal. Essentially, it took 25 years, right, to get from about the 50-50 point to when it was only 27% agree, and it took 2 years to go right back to where we were 25 years ago. Okay, that's a dramatic change of opinion. Okay, so that's the background. Okay. I'm going to spend a few minutes on what I call intergenerational mobility, and this is fun to present here because we actually collected this data anticipating this conference. This is new. It actually hasn't been published yet. We hope to publish it next week, so you're the first audience that's going to see this. So we've been asking questions about whether Canadians feel they're better off now financially than their parents were when they were their age, and then also whether they expect their children to be better off in the future when they're the same age as you are now when you're answering, right? So comparing across generations. So this is how people feel they're doing compared to where their parents were at their age. The proportion who feel better off, so it's going down. The proportion who feel worse off is going up. So the key point here is the lines have touched now, and this has never happened before. So we're now equally split between the proportion of Canadians who feel they're doing better than their parents did at their age and the proportion who feel they're doing worse. But there's a big age difference, right, in that. So the older you are, the more likely you are to feel that you're doing better compared to your parents. The younger you are, the less likely, right? The more likely you are to feel you're doing worse. That's not likely an age effect. There's a kind of generational thing. Old people like me, my parents lived through the Depression and the war and so on. Younger people in Canada, at least, maybe not so much. But one of the things that's interesting is that it's kind of a gradual age difference until you get to 60 plus, where it's actually a cliff. So we're going to talk about youth in a minute, and it's important to focus on youth. But in some of these economic indicators, the outlier is not youth. The outlier are older people who are very happy. Okay. So you can see that here. So this is the exact same thing, but just broken down over time for each of these age cohorts. So you can see for all the sort of 3 youngest age groups, I like putting people under 60 in one of the younger age groups, the lines cross now for the first time. So the first time more people are feeling worse off than their parents than better off. For those 60 plus, the lines are not crossing. at all. Okay. And the second question in this series is, do you expect your children to be better or worse off than you are now? So it's actually not this is not the worst answer we've ever had. It was a little worse coming out of the recession in the 1990s, but nonetheless a clear trend over the last decade at least, right, of increasing number of people who are worried that their children will not be progressing, right, economically compared to them. The age differences are a little more muted here, but nonetheless, the biggest change recently is in the youngest age cohort, who now expect to be worse off compared to their parents. So I'm going to kind of keep going with that and move into other measures of well-being. Again, this echoes a lot of what we heard last night and even some of the presentation today. Just kind of want to make a couple of points about the pattern which recurs, and so it's going to be very easy to spot across a number of different types of questions we ask. Sometimes we use a well-being index. Sometimes we ask about anxiety and depression, which I'll show you in a minute. Sometimes we just ask people to say how they feel their mental health is. The pattern is really clear. This is over several waves of this survey that we've done with the Future Skills Center, but the actual difference over the waves is not really the point here. The point is all of the well-being and mental health indicators in Canada are currently worse for young people compared to older people, and worse for women compared to men. And you can combine those, they are always worse for the youngest women, women in the youngest age cohort. So you can see that here with those reporting poor mental health, much higher for younger women. Exact same pattern here, experiencing, regularly experiencing anxiety, depression, loneliness. This is what I thought of last night. I was talking to Dan about this. Like as Carol was saying, this is not a you, right? This is a slope. So our younger people are more likely to be feeling lonely, depressed, anxious. This is just recurring different types of survey, mental health, anxiety. Again, so I'm just trying to show the gender element as well as the age element. Always worse on these indicators for younger women. And I think the last, I'm saying the same. I tend to say the same things over and over again. I think sometimes I do that just to make sure it wasn't one number we pulled out at one survey at one point in time, right? This is a recurring pattern. And I wasn't going to show this actually until Carol's talk last night because I didn't think it added much new, but we had a question about whether you have something to look forward to, right, in life. So it doesn't use the word hope in the question, but it kind of taps into that theme of hope. The most common response for each age group is, yeah, always or often. But when we showed this to our partners, they just said, wait a minute, the younger you are, the more likely you are to say you rarely or never have something to look forward to, which for older people is counterintuitive. You have your whole life, ahead of you. So I just wanted to sort of emphasize that in connection to the talk last night. Okay, this is a bit of a sideways jump for a moment. It's mostly because I do want to share the availability of this data with this audience. So now we're moving out of the sort of mental health aspect of well-being more to the economic aspect of well-being. And as Paul and others have raised, there's always this question of, some of our indicators, poverty measures, unemployment measures are not at historical highs or lows, depending. They're not particularly bad, at the moment. So why do we have all this unease and difficulty? And I'm not going to get into a lot of method, but the picture changes if you count things in different ways. So this is an initiative from Food Banks Canada with the research led by Joranda Naughton at University of Ottawa around a concept called material deprivation, which instead of taking poverty just as an income measure and setting a line of income that you have that defines whether you're doing well or not, it actually asks more, what can you afford, right, with whatever you have? So I'm not going to go through, I'm more just saying that this data is available for those who are interested, but what it does is ask about a number of things which families that are at an acceptable standard of living should be expected to have, whether it's access to health care or sufficient clothing or sufficient food for your family and so on. And counts the proportion of people in Canada who can or cannot afford those items and then tallies them all up. And the key here is, in this research, Joranda set the sort of cutoff for deprivation at 2 items or more. So 25% of Canadians cannot afford at least 2 of the items on our list. And the point is that's 2.5 times higher than the poverty rate, right? So this helps to bring into picture some of that anxiety that we're picking up when you use this measure. And then just rapidly here, of course, you can see that that 25% is the average. So it'd be higher for young people, it's higher for racialized people, it's higher for Indigenous, for those with disabilities, for those who rent, and so on, right? So there's other ways even to lead the opinion data behind and get more behavioral data to bring the picture into focus. Okay, I'm still doing okay here. I'm going to do another almost abrupt shift, but I'm going to try and weave it in. I'm like, I've heard there's this thing called the weave that you can do, right? And it shows that you're really intelligent. So that's what I'm doing here, okay? So we're going from well-being and poverty to technology. But it's partly because it's this theme of unsettled times, right? And what's unsettling us. And as we hear a lot of times, one of the things that's changing rapidly is technology, the use of technology in the workforce, artificial intelligence. What I want to say is our research so far is suggesting this is not what's driving the unsettlement that we're seeing in the Canadian population. Okay, so I'm just going to show some numbers, basically try to substantiate that first box. Canadian workers are not especially anxious about the impact of technology in the workplace. So just look at the bottom one here. I worry that I might lose my job. I feel that some of these numbers got crunched together, but nonetheless, I worry that I might lose my job in the coming years because the robots are coming to take my job, basically. Yes, some people are worried, right? Most people are not, particularly worried about that. Sorry, the formatting did not, take my word for it, that's what the slide said. The formatting somehow did not transfer to I'm blaming Apple. Points here, most workers will say, yes, technology is changing the way I do the work, right? So there's not this sort of sense that nothing's happening. But when you say, well, what is the effect of that change? Is it making your job more enjoyable, better paid, more secure? So there's a range of responses, right? Not everyone says it's making their jobs more enjoyable, more secure, better paid. Some people are, but the positive ones, or at least positive plus neutral, largely outweighs the negative. I'm not trying to discount the negative. I'm just trying to say that when you look for like the broad patterns of what's affecting people's sort of sense of security, it does not seem to be technology. 29% of Canadian workers right now say they're using AI at work to help them in tasks in their jobs. By the way, if you're a professor here, 52% of Canadian students say they're using AI to help with their assignments right now, and the other 48 are not answering the survey correctly. But if you say, well, again, for those who are using AI, what's the effect, right? See the red bars there, like only like the negative response is really, really small. Okay, so that's the technology section. I don't think that's the issue. I've got very little time left to make one or two closing points. I'm going to switch to a whole different theme, but bring it back to well-being. I could do a whole separate presentation on trusted democracy, satisfaction with democracy, trust in institutions, and so on. I'm going to focus more on trust in other people, because I'm going to say that underpins a democracy more than it's okay to distrust your leaders, but we should probably trust our neighbors, right? So the red bar here, you can see, like most people, very little people have low trust in the people they work with, the people whose ethnic background is different from yours, even people whose political views are different than yours. There's not that many people who are distrustful. Yes, we're distrustful more of political leaders and strangers. If you take that question, do you trust people who have a very different ethnic background than you? And you break that down by your immigrant background or your racial identity, there's a range of views again. The point I'm trying to show here is this is not what distinguishes who trusts and who doesn't, people who are different from them, right? In other words, the cleavage in our society, when we ask about ethnic difference, is not ethnicity itself, right? But what is the cleavage? The cleavage on all of these sort of social trust indicators comes back to security, well-being, income security. So a number of different trust measures here. And again, I think the slide doesn't transfer very well, but you can see the slope, right? So trust in other people correlates directly, in this case, with income security, but it correlates with all of the things we've talked about: income security, mental health, sense of connectedness to friends and family in your community, right? These are the strong relationships between the trust that underpins the cohesion that underpins our society. And I'll just show it the last one. This is using a well-being index. and taking a measure of trust in your neighbors. So basically, the better you are in terms of health, standard of living, connection to your community, the more trusting you are of other people. And you can even do this with the question about different political, you're interested in political polarization, right? Which seems a different topic than well-being. But I think I'm trying to argue with this slide that it's not really a different topic than well-being, right? It all tightly relates. Okay, I'm out of time. This I'll bring up in comment.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and our other panelists. That was an absolutely fascinating tour through some critically important issues. So that was just an amazing setup, I think, for what I think is a short Q&A. Dan, how are we doing on time? We can go about 20 minutes in the Q&A. Maybe I'll start off just getting a bit of conversation amongst the panelists here. There are a few common themes in the presentation. We've talked about issues of inequality, intergenerational issues, some of the drivers like housing and affordability, questions of social mobility. There's a range of tools in the toolkit that can deal with these issues. Some of them, like the housing crisis we have, is kind of a long game. You can't wave a magic wand and double the housing supply. Affordability, we're seeing easing with inflation coming down. But when you think about all the other instruments in the toolkit, Kelly, you were talking about the tax transfer system, minimum wage. There's kind of the ground game of direct intervention and programs and services. We've talked a bit about some of the labor market policy frameworks as being critical. Any of you want to share any further reflections on the relative importance of those different entry points? Like there's causal connections between these points, but it's a bit bewildering to think about what is the best entry point into some of the multiple pressures that we're facing right now. Anyone want to jump in? Stefano?
Thank you, Paul. And I found these two presentations after mine absolutely fascinating. Maybe a compliment to what Kelly was saying and actually what Andrew was saying, because at OECD in 2017, we published a report, The Broken Elevator, in which we look at social mobility. I think Andrew was showing the fact that, if you think about this generation compared to the previous generation, there is a significant proportion of people that think they cannot do as good as their parents. And this is really surprising, the first time we have seen that. At OECD, we actually look at the elasticity, income elasticity between father and son, and we look also at the distribution of income, not disposable income. And for Canada, we end up with a number which is 4. So it takes 4 generations for a sibling of a family of low income, the 10% the lowest income, from a probabilistic point of view, to reach the median income. 4 generations is 120 years. So that's the perspective of someone coming from a low income family. Will take not himself, not the son or daughter, but actually 4 generations to, on probabilistic point of view, to be able to reach the medium. So that's, I think, is what is behind this, in the sense also of lack of hope for the young generation. And I think this points, in my view, to the need to invest much more on human capital, on the ability of people to actually strive into what is going to be a very rapidly changing economy and society. I think in Canada, you have universal access to education and also to health. But when we look at the educational outcome, think about the PISA result, or actually we're going to release in December the PIEC result, which is the adult skills survey. There is a huge differences in terms of educational outcome among the 15 years old and also among the adult and also the young population who enter the labor market. So yes, access is achieved in country and most of the OECD country. Quality of education is not. And I think it's not just reaching out to a certain level of education, including tertiary education, but also the quality of the skills and competent individual achieve. So I think this is if you look at health, again, Canada is a country with certainly universal access to health services, but yet I think the health outcomes for different groups in the population are very different. It's not just a question of access, a question of the quality of care they get. And again, the Paris survey, the patient report indicator survey, which Canada is part of, shows that for those with low level of income, the perceived quality of the health system is much, much lower than for those actually with middle or higher level of income. So again, there is a socioeconomic condition shape access and quality of education, shape access to health. And I think these are 2 essential components to actually build the kind of human capital broadly defined that will allow people to strive and to be able to grasp the opportunities and address some of the major risks they're facing. So I think we have to focus more not on the aggregate, but a disaggregated number about access to these two essential components, which is again, health, education. Education is actually through technical education, academic learning, transition from education to the labor market. This is where we have to make further progress. Even a country like Canada that is certainly doing much better than many other OECD countries.
Thanks, Stefano. Kelly, anything you wanna?
No, I think I'll wait for more questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Andrew?
If I understood your question, I mean, I think the thing I want to say is come back to that, the point I was trying to making between looking at income, right? And we tend to do that, right? In social policy, we have income cutoffs for access to child benefit and a number of other things. And also the narrative about youth is, you know, again, really important. That's why I was showing some of those well-being indicators. But there's also this sense that if you look primarily about income, then that also sort of wears off, right? Because young people, when they start in the labor market, they start at the bottom rung. And so of course they're going to kind of feel stressed and a little unhappy and so on, but then they'll start earning more. And if you look at but then if you look at some of the other measures, it's really middle-aged, middle income, right? Where the greatest sort of unhappiness or unsettled or stress is, right? You know, I'm triangulating, but the guess is that's directly related to housing. So in other words, what's not happening is what we would normally start in a shaky economy. It's hard for young people to get established. It's harder for them to find the permanent job they're looking for. Their incomes are less secure. But the people in their 40s who've gone through that, right, they're fine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're not seeing.
Okay, very good.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just had a thought, yeah, because I reflecting on the youth, housing, but also I can't imagine that the environment is not playing a huge role in people's perspective, especially young people's perspective. And I think in terms of having access to well-being, education is really an insider-outsider kind of game, especially when we think about what we heard last night from Professor Graham about the deaths of despair in the US, whereas really like having a college degree or not having a college degree is one of the determinants of that. And you have more and more dialogue in the US that there's no value to college. And even in the US election, they're constantly talking about jobs for people without college. And I think we don't want to catch that sort of point of view in Canada. One, we're really different. We have an enormous non-university PSE sector that, you know, up until recently has been very healthy. And we have the, you know, very high share of people with more than high school across the OECD. And another thing is that education policy is inherently gendered. And average wages and average earnings for women are only reach the level of high school average and college educated men if they have degrees. And so I think we have to sort of keep that in mind in terms of the role that having education plays in terms of social inclusion.
That's great. So human capital, housing being amongst the key entry points, I think, to some of the issues we've been talking about. When I open it up to the floor, we have a question already. I think there's a roving mic somewhere that can come over. Great. If people, again, could introduce themselves when they make their question.
Hi, my name is Amin Mawani. Your comment entry about middle age is where the greatest dissatisfaction comes in. Maybe could this be relative standing? So I'm still doing fine. I have the latest iPhone, but I see others have done so much better that I'm beginning to feel dissatisfied. So it's not absolute income, it's relative income starts coming into the picture.
I mean, yes and no is the direct answer, because like yes is the easy part. I mean, we live in a society where we benchmark ourselves against what we see around us and what we expected and so on. So you could see, you know, certainly from a social policy, like I'm lucky enough to teach in this school. And one of the questions I ask my students when we talk about some of these issues is, why should the government help you buy a house? Why is that a policy issue at all, right? Except then when you work with Food Banks Canada and you talk to them about what's going on, right? And more of their clients are employed full-time. Housing is eating up all of their budget, and they're using food banks. So yes and no.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, we'll open it up. Yes, question third row there.
Thank you very much for the presentations. They were really excellent. My question is especially for Stefano. You mentioned that in terms of labor force participation, some countries have an especially aging population, like Korea, for example. And so a lot of people are aging out of the labor market. And one of the solutions to that, I believe you proposed, was that, do like retraining and that kind of thing to try to get them to adapt to like AI and all of these changes that are coming. But I wonder, to some extent, what role should migration play in this? Like, should countries instead be focusing more on training the migrant labor force that is coming in to kind of fill that participation, especially in countries with a lower birth rate, which we are definitely seeing in some of these OECD countries? Thank you.
Very good. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Usha. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto.
Great.
No, thank you very much for this question, because I think there are at least two main dimensions. One is that I don't think we are doing enough, and Canada is doing better than many other countries, at investing in our seniors. I mean, there is one statistic that is basically applied to all countries of the OECD. So the countries spend more on training, retraining for the adult population. If you look at access to training, formal and informal, by age groups, the young people receive much more training at the middle age and much more than the older workers, those 45 plus. If you look at the distribution by firm size, workers in large companies receive much more training than those in small firms. Women and men, more men than women, and so on and so forth. So yes, our training, retraining program, for which many countries spend a lot of money, is actually skewed to those who potentially need training the least, and those who need it the most get the least access to training and retraining. And this is not a phenomenon in Canada, a few countries, a phenomenon in all of the OECD countries. Has to do with policy, how much we invest on training, retraining, but also on the way in which we target training opportunities. But actually, there is a big ageism in companies. For many employers, workers beyond a certain age are potentially a problem because they have to be paid more, because there is a sort of a wage that increases with tenure on the job, and there is a perception that may be less productive or less adaptable to the new technology, which is actually not true. So much of the work we are doing at OECD is now working better with the age, in which we look at what kind of policies can address the ageism that we do see in most of our countries. Certainly it's training and retraining, but actually adapting working condition. But you need to have the employers on board, because without that, I think whatever legislation you have in place, it might not be fully appropriate. Now, it's interesting enough, because I was in Davos in 2023, with the AARP, which is the big association of retired persons in the United States, and we published a report on working better with age. And for the first time, we got many CEOs coming to our session, and many of them say, well, we have a huge problem here of labor shortage. We cannot find the talent on the market. Maybe we have to invest a bit more on our seniors, because there's a huge human capital that we might not be. The way in which you actually brought them into the conversation by some evidence through surveys that those companies that have a better, more balanced age structure actually are more productive. It's not just a question that we have to sort of address aging and the demographic changes, but actually a better, more balanced age structure may be also something good for the company. Because I think it was yesterday, Dr. Graham said that the senior bring more experience. There is less anxiety. They have a lot of knowledge and experience. And we bring me to the second point quickly onto migration. I think Canada is a country of immigration, is a country in which I would say there is a proactive migration policy. There are challenges, there is no question about it. But I mean, in the survey, and there was this big uptick. Until recently, I think migration was perceived to be something positive. Of course, you have to see how things develop with the housing market, which may or may not be related to migration. This is not the case in a number of OECD countries, including my own country, in which migration is not really a well-designed policy. So Italy is a particular position geographically, so we receive a lot of immigrants from the African continent. We definitely have to bring migration into the conversation about age. It's not going to be solving the problem of aging, there is no question about it, but there is a lot we can do into the integration of migrants into our labor market. Canada is doing relatively well. If you look at the employment rate, it's doing less well if you look at distribution of jobs, so where the migrants actually are. But this has been many decades, I think, of proactive migration policy and a lot of action also on making sure that you have the proper integration into the labor market. Other countries are lagging behind on that. I think about Japan and Korea, for example. Migration was not an issue. So we work on 38 member countries. We have done a number of country reports on migration integration policies. Japan never asked for a report from the OECD. 2 years ago, they asked for the first time to a report on the labor migration integration because they realized that they have to also use the migration tool, if you like, to some extent to address some of the demographic changes. But this has to be coordinated also across country because otherwise it's a zero-sum game because we are all competing for talent, and this is not the way in which I think we have to design policy, not nationally, but more internationally.
That's great, Stefano. I think it's also a topic we need to stay right on top of, make sure that we've got the most recent information on integration of newcomers to Canada to make sure that we're staying on top of the game, because there is some evidence that it might be slipping a little bit, and how do we actually stay on top of that? I'm going to go to Karen, then to the back row, then to the front row, and then I think we might be approaching the end. We'll take maybe 3 more. Karen, right here. Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen. I'm the CEO of Blueprint. Thank you for such a fascinating panel. I can't really remember a panel where I felt like I learned so much. So there were a few things that really struck me. So I think one is how we build our understanding as decision makers, as policymakers in this country, because some of the things that we traditionally pay attention to are no longer telling us what I think we need to know. And Andrew, I think you made that point so brilliantly, really understanding the differences by age. Like that was really fascinating in terms of how people are feeling. And, you know, I think I'm on the organizing committee for this conference, right? And I'm thinking about the age of the people in the organizing, you know, and how, you know, we might have understood the issues and thinking about it, how different that is. So that was sort of one thing that struck me. Also interested in that people didn't see their workplaces in the labor market as the biggest source of problem, and your analysis that pinpointed housing, and then tying, Kelly, to what you talked about, and you talked about some of the reasons why wage inequality hasn't grown the same way, you know, the effectiveness of our transfer system, also minimum wage, but of course minimum wage, you showed how powerful it is, but that only works for a small segment of our distribution, right? It's limited in terms of what it can do. And then also that it doesn't connect to affordability, and Andrew, with the material deprivation. So I'm curious about instruments. And Stefano, you showed that housing affordability isn't as much of a problem in some OECD countries. So like, what can we learn from what others are doing? And what instruments are most important given what we're learning?
Great. Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, to speak to the point of minimum wages, I don't know that I would say that they only affect small segment of the society, because they sort of spill up the distribution, right? You know, if the lowest wage workers get a raise, then everybody, you know, sort of cascades up beyond the people who are directly affected by it. I think there's more limits in terms of how much economic rent there is in the market, essentially, before you start seeing costs in other ways, especially inflation, right? You can't constantly be raising wages if there's a lot of price pressure. You know, but there's other labor market institutions, and you know, whenever there's a tight labor market, I think there's a lot of concern from the business side of things. And there's kind of a mismatch. And I think it's important to keep in mind that tight labor markets are good for workers. so the instruments are there, and sometimes it's politics and not the instruments, right? So, and I'm not a political person. Yeah, I'll leave it there and let the others comment.
No, thank you. Maybe build on that. Three quick observations. One is that I think Andrew showed it. We have our own also well-being indicators. We have our survey on risk that matter. We have the new survey Paris. I think the challenge we are still facing how to translate the results from these surveys into policy making. And I think we are not there yet on that. So the information is there. The survey actually speak for themselves and they're quite telling, but we are not yet there in actually drawing from the lesson from this survey, from this material on well-being, on what matters for people into the policy making. And I think this is our job, policymakers and even at OECD. But I must say we are not there. But certainly risk that matter has been a game changer in the way we discuss about social policy and social protection at OECD in our committees. I hope that the Paris survey about health outcome from the perspective of patients will also change the perspective on how we actually assess the performance of the health sector. But we are not there yet. That's the first point. Second, I think Kelly was making a very important point. We have 30 countries of the OECD with a minimum wage, and the minimum wage has been a major tool to basically at least protect the low wage workers from the big spike in prices, in inflation, right? Now we have another problem. So there is no one single instrument that can address the complexity of problem we are facing. In many of the OECD countries now, we are facing what the French call the smicardisation, meaning that there are more workers now at the minimum wage because the minimum wage has been increasing, but wages above the minimum wage have not kept pace. Actually, interesting enough, real wages have declined in half of the OECD countries. Still today, they are lower than where they were in 2019. So there has been a compression of wages, and actually for many workers, they get trapped into the new minimum wages because employers have very little incentive to bring them up. Because in France, for example, in other countries, you get actually reduction in social security contribution for work at the minimum wage. So you see, one instrument is good, but you have to take into account what might be the side effect of that. And the final point is what you can call social dialogue. So we have run a survey of the impact of artificial intelligence on the workplace, 2,000 companies, 5,300 workers. And actually 3 out of 4 workers were pretty positive. This was good for the performance, my performance. Actually, this was good for the quality of my job because I can transfer the more repetitive, sometimes dangerous part of my job to the algorithm. I can focus the most interesting part. Yet, the low-skilled workers were very concerned about the future of their job. Would I still have my job in 10 years' time or even 5 years' time? But certainly one other important result was that the performance and the feeling about the quality of the job was much, much higher when the workers were consulted on the use of artificial intelligence in their company. So social dialogue, meaning explaining why you're using that particular piece of technology, what are the objectives of that, and explain how you're using the result for the algorithm, I think is quite important. We have a survey now on what we call algorithm management in the workplace, and I think the result will be quite telling. So there is a lot you can do also to bring workers in this case into the conversation about how you use the new technology.
Great. What I'm going to do, Dan, if you agree, there was a question in the back and one in the front. I'll take them both together and then we'll do some concluding. Will that keep us on track? Okay. So there was a hand up in the back row there and then a question in the front. And then I'll just ask the panel for final reflections. And if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Eunice. I'm a double master student in public administration and global affairs at the LSC and Monk School. Thank you very much for your insights. I wanted to ask about whether you see any value or potential in adopting a human rights lens in measurements of well-being, and whether you might see trade-offs between like the well-beings of certain subpopulations in your surveys and whether there's like necessarily a dichotomy. So for example, with recent changes to the temporary foreign workers program, I wonder if this might be informed by, say, the changes in income security and housing affordability shown in the Environics Institute survey results, for example, and whether like human rights narratives like that raised in the UN Special Rapporteur's report have been subsumed in this policy response. So just like as a whole, the human rights approach to well-being. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. We'll take one in the front row and then some final, right up here. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Henry. I'm a retired government economist and foreign service officer. And my question is regarding how we measure the economy, particularly across countries, when Canada is unique in the number of workers that it has who have very few years in the workforce. We're quite asymmetric from the rest of the OECD and very asymmetric from our neighbor to the south. And whether that metric is being used. And I just wanted to throw out that it may not be understood that Canada, the government of Canada, doesn't actually measure skills. What they ask new arrivals, when they ask them at all, is what is their intended occupation and number of years in formal education. And I wonder if the panel could comment on how that might color our view and color their capacity to identify what they can do in the Canadian economy.
Okay, a couple of great questions there, the human rights lens, and then this notion of skills versus competencies, which I'm sure you have some reflections on. Stefano, you want to concluding thoughts and or reflections on those last two questions? Andrew?
I think maybe I'll go first because I think I have the shortest answer. I mean, for the human rights lens, I think my answer is, I'm sure you're right. I'm not quite sure where that would lead, but I think the point I would say is from the survey research point of view, we always have to question whether we're asking the right questions, right? Whether there are different ways, different ways to present the sample, different issues to ask about, different topics to do it. And the human rights research community can help us do our research better. That's what I would say.
Great. Kelly, anything on credentials versus competencies in the marketplace and whether either on immigration or domestic workforce development?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still sort of thinking about the human rights.
Okay,
So
yeah.
this was a question about immigration.
Yeah.
Or was that what the
Yeah,
question was
this is
about?
about how we yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an economist, so your wage is your skill. Yeah, no, I'm not sure how you would do that in a meaningful way, in a way that would be coherent across, other than, you know, these surveys like the PIAC but you know, that's not an entry point. Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at my phone this morning, so I don't even know what our immigration policy is right now.
It's
So
tighter.
sorry. Yeah.
Look at Paul's phone.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay. Stefano, do you want to?
Yeah, two part of the answer to your great question. So one, yes, we look at the labor market outcomes disaggregated by different dimension, including also by length of stay in the host country. So that's what we do at OECD. And of course, this matters not just for Canada, but certainly for Canada, perhaps more than other countries. But actually, we are releasing in a couple of weeks the International Migration Outlook, which is all about migration policy flows, but also integration. And there we look into the detail about how length of stay, first generation, second generation, even third generation, the outcome on the labor market. It's actually interesting how much difference there are across countries, take into account regular migrants, refugees, and the outcome in the labor market for the first and second generation, so the offspring of migrants. So this is certainly something which is very important. The second part of your question was actually, what are we measuring here? We look at about credential, we look at degrees, educational outcome from that point of view, or actually the actual skills of individual. And that's certainly a major problem. We are talking about the migrant population because they might have different degrees, they might have different characteristics in the country of origin and so on. I think Kelly was referring to the PIAC survey, which is the adult skills survey. We are going to release it on the 10th of December, in which we look at how the skills on literacy, numeracy, and problem solving has evolved over the past 10 years in 30 countries, including Canada. I cannot sort of tell you what are the results, but are not very encouraging. But there we look also what is the role of a different composition of the population and different composition also in terms of migration. And we try to look at the evolution of the past 10 years of the average skills of the population for the native born and also for the migrants. Of course, in a country like Canada, that component of migration play a role in the averages. And I think my whole point is that you have to go beyond the average. We have to look at how different groups by migration status, by many other different characteristics, actually to some extent play out on the labor market, what specific needs they have, and try to address them.
Great. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time. This, as I said, was a fascinating tour through a range of complex and interconnected issues. I might just conclude on the point that Stefano made is that we have our work cut out for us as policy practitioners, I think, to dig in to all these trends and think through the transmission of that into policy making. I would agree that we're not where we need to be on that, but it is events like this that shed light on these important indicators, and I think point the direction for us. So thanks you to all three of you for great presentations and a good discussion.